In this episode, Ross Benjamin talks about his translation of Kafka's Diaries. Ross Benjamin is a translator of German language literature living in Nyack, New York. His translations include Friedrich Hölderlin's Hyperion, Joseph Roth's Job, Thomas Pletzinger's Funeral for a Dog, and Daniel Kehlmann's You Should Have Left and Tyll. His translation of Tyll was shortlisted for the 2020 Booker International Prize. He was awarded the Helen and Wolff Translators Prize, National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship, and a 2015 Guggenheim Fellowship. His translation of Franz Kafka's complete Diaries was published by Schocken Books in 2022.
I was about 15 when I started reading Kafka, but I was introduced to him by two friends in high school. And those were the first friendships that I forged based on a mutual interest in literature. And we were reading different things to each other, and they introduced me to Kafka as we were reading aloud to each other in the high school library during either free periods or when we ought to have been somewhere else, but found ourselves nonetheless in the library reading the old translations by the Muirs of Kafka's collected stories, his complete stories, actually, to each other out loud, and his the unfinished novels, The Trial in the Castle. I think because we were reading out loud, we immediately tapped into the humor of Kafka and found ourselves constantly bursting out laughing while reading The Judgment, when the father stands up on the bed to tower over his son, or when the son notices the father's underwear isn't entirely clean. We would just crack up. And then in that same complete stories collection, there was an introduction written by John Updike where he told the now familiar anecdote of that Max Brod was the first to tell, of how when Kafka would read his stories aloud to his friends, he would himself often burst out laughing, and they would all be laughing. And this was not at all surprising to me. I noticed it was portrayed as surprising, and that was the only surprising thing, because Kafka's reputation had become so associated with the part of his work that's nightmarish and full of anxiety and alienation, and he'd become an avatar of this modern alienation, as we know, with his name becoming synonymous with this atmosphere of uncanniness and persecution and so on that you don't immediately think of as funny. But the immediacy of the humor in his work comes through, I think, particularly when you read it out loud. So it was a perfect introduction to that Kafka for me, and that was therefore an advantage in already having maybe a more multi-dimensional experience of Kafka than the myth of the sort of angst-ridden, recluse, monkish, martyr to literature and prophet of totalitarianism and all of that that's associated with him. That those associations I learned about kind of after that more immediate youthful experience, which again may not be unusual. That may be fairly typical of people who fall in love with Kafka, that they experience him first and foremost as readers, and then later start to absorb the huge cultural, or that's better, I guess, when it happens that way. Some people know that Kafka is such a monumental, mythologized, and overinterpreted figure, and are so maybe are partly intimidated by that whole scholarly world of secondary literature about Kafka and so on, that they don't realize that if they just opened it and began reading it, they would immediately be welcomed into a world that is, in some odd way, strangely accessible, even as it resists easy interpretation. The stories are, their appeal is almost irresistible to a reader encountering them for the first time, as long as that kind of mythologization hasn't gotten in your way, I think. So that I do think was an ideal entry into Kafka's world. And it was, soon thereafter that I started to explore the letters and the diaries, reading his more personal writings and getting to know this really, the more multifarious aspects of his identity and of his sort of context that come through in the letters and diaries, including the really explicit grappling with his Jewishness.
You're a reader turned into a translator because of Kafka.
My approach to translation is deeply informed by my sense of myself as a reader first, and maybe a writer second. But and that doesn't have to be that way. That's not the only way to be a translator. But I the idea of translation, which is, of course, a form of writing, also being a form of really deep readerly engagement with a text, is kind of the natural course of how I came to translation, because it was because I read enthusiastically writers like Kafka, Celan, Josef Roth, German-speaking writers of the first half of the 20th century, that I decided, first of all, to learn German in order to be able to read them in the original, and secondly, had the impulse to translate them into English to sort of capture what I felt I was experiencing as a reader in reading the German versions of some of these works sufficiently in my English translations to share that experience with readers in my own tongue, and to capture that experience of reading. So I think that was probably the primary impulse to becoming a translator of German language literature.
So when did you conceive this project?
I could only conceive this project once I became aware that the English edition of the Diaries that I'd read when I was in my adolescence, and I read the existing translation that had been published in 1948-49. It was only once I read German, was in Berlin at a bookstore. I was actually just recently back in this bookstore, Dussmann, and saw in that bookstore my translation of the Diaries with the rest of the Kafka table on the centenary of his death. And this was a huge full circle moment for me, because back in 2003, I was looking at the Kafka edition in German, thinking, now it's time, I can finally read Kafka in the original. My German's finally gotten good enough. I was living there. I was on a Fulbright there. I was living in Berlin at the time, shortly after graduating from college. And I decided I would reread the Kafka that I'd read in English, now in German, as had been my dream in starting to learn German in the first place. And as I was reading through this edition, I think already in the bookstore itself, I was looking at the Diaries and just recognized that this is a wholly different version than what I had seen in English. Edition of the Diaries prepared in German by Max Brod, Kafka's closest friend and the executor of his literary estate, who had heavily censored and downright rewritten aspects of the Diaries, had really intrusively intervened as an editor in preparing this edition, left a lot out and reshaped a lot, some of it beyond recognition when you look at the more faithful transcriptions that I was now seeing in the German critical edition, which I was looking at in 2003 in this bookstore. It had already been out in German since the early 90s. So this German edition had sort of supplanted the earlier German edition by Brod that had been the basis of the earlier English translation. That was, and when I read this for the first time, it came alive for me in a way that even though that former edition of the Diaries, which I had found fascinating and captivating, but had not realized how it wasn't exactly what Kafka had written. And when I saw what Kafka had written, it was even more alive and in motion and embodied. And there was so much more of his body in it, of his sexuality, of his ambivalence about Jewishness, about Zionism, about anything that he was ambivalent about, where Max Brod had a more definitive sense of where he thought Kafka should be on those subjects, like even sexuality maybe, or some of that may have been not Max Brod himself, but his sense of the readers at that time and what they would be willing to stomach. So the homoerotic stuff was all censored. Brod censored all that. It's not clear it was because Brod was homophobic or something. It was probably his sense of what was of a sense of sort of propriety given biases at the time or something. But in any case, reading this in German, my first thought was, well, this is incredible and will surely soon be coming out in English. Because I did know that the manuscript versions of the Trial and the Castle that were part of the same critical edition and that also supplanted editions that had been done by Brod. And in the 90s, when those German editions had come out of the Trial, the Castle, the unfinished manuscripts, posthumous writings, they had begun to be translated and published by Schocken Books as restored editions or based on the manuscripts. The translation of the Trial was undertaken by Breon Mitchell and maintained a lot of the approach I took in the Diaries to showing, for example, Kafka's unorthodox punctuation and spelling errors and sentences that might break off mid-sentence, sometimes even mid-word, and leaving those rough edges for all to see. Those were based on the editorial principles of the German critical edition and had been, to a large extent, preserved by these new translations by Brian Mitchell of The Trial and Mark Harmon of The Castle and the novel. Broad had titled America, but Kafka's working title was something that Harmon more accurately translated as The Missing Person. Others have translated as The Man Who Disappeared, to Verschollene. And so those had come out in the 90s, which brings me back to 2003 when I read this exciting, really thrilling version of the Diaries and realized, what a rich glimpse this would be for English-speaking audiences into his creative process and his multi-sidedness as a person, a real sort of counter to the Kafka myth of purity and so on. I just assumed this would be next in a line of publications that Schocken was doing of the manuscript versions of the posthumous writings. And, as years passed, I became a translator of German literature myself and still thought this must be coming down the pike until I think it was around 2013, 2014, when a publisher asked me, who was not Schocken, asked me what my dream project would be. I sort of scanned my bookshelves and saw, there's the Diaries. They still haven't been translated, and that's my dream project. That's something I want everybody to the English-speaking world to be able at least to see the Kafka of the Diaries that I got to see by reading the German edition, if I could possibly convey that in my translation. And signed on to do it with this other publisher and spent about the next 4 or 5 years postponing my deadline, maybe squandering some of my credibility with that publisher. I had explained at the outset exactly what it was. I was translating a much messier, more unfiltered version of Kafka's writing, unpolished, with a lot of idiosyncrasies and quirks, and including outright errors, and that I wanted to preserve all of that. They had seemed interested in that approach until they finally saw, after years of delays, what I'd come up with, the end result. And then they were, I suppose, put off by the level of fidelity to Kafka's, to what I call this fertile disarray, or this beautiful mess of the Diaries. They didn't find it so beautiful. They just found it to be a mess and worried it was unreadable and all kinds of, publishing concerns that I don't want to trivialize. It took a while, almost a year, before it became really clear that our creative differences were irreconcilable and that they really wanted a much more polished and smoothed out version of the Diaries that contravened, in its entirety, the very reason I embraced this translation. So then I went where I would have gone initially if I just thought, I want to translate Kafka's Diaries. Let me find a publisher. I would have immediately gone to Schocken and said, look, you're doing these, which, by the way, in America, we always call Schocken. I just have this weird interference of the German pronunciation of Salman Schocken's name. In Israel, I think, known as Schocken because that's the Hebrew pronunciation of the now separate branch of Schocken Books in Israel. But anyway, Schocken had been doing this already, and they had a blueprint for it, which was sort of the blueprint I took when I began to translate the Diaries. When I did bring it there, thank God they understood what I was doing. They had higher hopes for what I was doing than the previous publisher had. And especially, thank God, that they turned out to be right, that readers have, it seems, embraced this Kafka, and very few, I'm sure some people are irritated in the way those readers were at the original publisher, by some of the, convolutions or confusing aspects of a text that really, even the writer of that text, the diarist, when he's writing his diaries, doesn't necessarily make sense even to himself. So if it's not going to make sense to the reader, you can go two ways with that. You can feel like, wow, this is really feels like reading somebody's diaries. It feels really authentic because it makes no sense, just like real diaries don't make sense. Or you could get frustrated that you can't make sense of it. So I'm sure both responses are out there for readers and are available to readers. I'm glad both responses are available. I think that's the way it should be. But largely it seems that luckily, it hasn't been dismissed as unreadable or as some kind of, by most people, it hasn't been thought that it somehow diminishes Kafka in any way to see these other sides of him.
You consider his diaries as a work of serious literature. And the other day I was talking to Mark Herman on our podcast. And interestingly, he too said diaries are his literary workshop.
Yeah, it's true. And I think it becomes apparent as soon as you begin reading them, because even the very first entries, you can't tell if they're personal diary entries about things he witnessed or if they're attempts to write fiction. They have a literary quality, certainly, to the sentences. They're undated, those very first entries, and they're descriptive and observational, and they include, literary tropes and metaphors, and you can't tell. And so do his entries that are obviously personal, where you know the biographical context of the entry. They nonetheless often have a literary quality, and some of them, in fact, you read a diary entry about the noise in his apartment and his sister's making noise and his father making noise. And it's written in this very, like a prose poem. And then if you flip to the endnotes, you find out, well, this diary entry he actually published in a literary journal as a prose piece called Great Noise, which then also was collected in his first collection of short prose as a literary piece. And all he did to change the diary entry was change his sister's names to initials, and otherwise it's intact entirely what he wrote, what seems like a diary entry, but also seems like something that he was writing with a great literary intensity. So those are sort of the entries that are on this threshold between life and literature, where well, this at least in some sense was biographical or personal. Like maybe he was writing a diary entry and they thought, oh, this sounds good, I could use this, or maybe he was from the very start thinking, well, I'm putting my pen to the page. I'm transforming whatever I'm writing into literature. There's other ones where, like at the very beginning of the Diaries, one of the ways in which you, as a reader, will very quickly get the impression, oh, Kafka used his diaries as a literary workshop, is there's this series of fragments that the title only comes actually in the second notebook. So in the first notebook, there's a series of fragments. In the second notebook, which he began around contemporaneously with the first, but then he was very... that's another thing about my diaries. They're not in chronological order. Neither is the German critical edition, because it goes by notebook, because Kafka would mix up which notebooks he was using. And so the title of this series of fragments, The Little Ruin Dweller, only appears in the second notebook. But toward the beginning of the first notebook, you get these fragments where he mentions a dweller in the ruins. He mentions wishing he had been a dweller in the ruins instead of having the upbringing he had. Each of these little fragments, each of which breaks off for him, only for him to resume rewriting from the beginning, what using a lot of the same material, but taking it in some different directions. Each of them begins, I must say, or I must confess, my education has in many ways done me harm. And then he proceeds to list a number of his educators, the people who he reproaches with this harmful upbringing and education. And it gets very comical very quickly. It starts, of course, with parents and people that you would expect, teachers, people you would expect to be part of this, either Kafka's or this character's, let's say, education. And then it goes on to people as remote as, some ladies in city parks, or a helmsman, a swimming instructor. And then it goes in all sorts of directions in about a dozen, I think 11 actually, diary entries, all of which he breaks off and then reworks in successive entries. So these drafts, you already see him drafting, right? You can see, okay, he's workshopping this material. But at least at the beginning, you also think, well, maybe much like that other entry, it's a later entry, the one about the noise, it seems fairly autobiographical. He mentions, there's even footnotes, he mentioned, or endnotes. He mentions a cook who took him to school every year as one of the people he reproaches for his education. And then there's an endnote pointing readers to a letter where he described this cook, in a reminiscence in a letter, in one of his letters. So there was a cook who took him to school for a year, and he describes her, autobiographically elsewhere. So you start off reading it and you think, okay, this is maybe autobiographical material being treated in a literary manner. And then at a certain point, he just outright says, I'm 40 years old and I'm short and rather fat. None of which applied to Kafka at the time. He was 20-something. He was, unusually tall, especially for the time period, and often complained that he couldn't gain weight and didn't have an ounce of fat on his body, as we can see in pictures as well. So suddenly, it's completely fictionalized, and you don't know when he made this transition between life and literature, or if for him it even is a transition, or if as soon as he sets his pen to the page, which is more the direction in which I at least treated the diaries, or understood what was going on as a reader and as a translator, as soon as he sets the pen to the page, I think he's in a process of literary creation, sometimes literary self-creation, sometimes just literary performance, sometimes something that might be described as like finger exercises, right? But often I think his hope was that as he got underway writing, that he would be swept away by inspiration into a fulfilling, creation of a literary work, even when he was writing in his diaries. And you see it then actually finally happen in the diaries themselves when he composes the entire text of the short story, The Judgment, in the notebooks of the diaries themselves. And then immediately in the following diary entry the next morning, because he wrote in one ferocious overnight session, and you can see the ferocity because in the diary version, unlike in the polished published version, I've left in, where suddenly the paragraph breaks and the line breaks start disappearing, the punctuation starts disappearing as he's becoming swept away. And then he describes in the following entry precisely how that happened, how at a certain point he didn't look up from the paper anymore, and he's so proud of himself that he wrote through a night and that he wrote it all in one sitting. He says, this is the way writing must be done, in one cohesive act. This isn't his words. His words are something like a complete opening up of your soul. He was really, his picture of creative fulfillment was this picture of a kind of outpouring, something almost like automatic writing.
Before I move on to the final question, let me deviate a bit. What are you currently working on as far as translations go?
I'm putting something like the finishing touches on the new Daniel Kehlmann novel, who's a contemporary writer. He's a contemporary writer I've translated now for some time. I did his last two novels, and this is the novel he wrote after Tyll that came out in German already, and will be coming out in English in 2025, so next year, in the first half of the year, and it's called The Director by Daniel Kehlmann.
Last couple of months, I have been reading about Kafka. I was reading Kafka. So, I read about Kafka's stories and novels. His novels are interpreted through his personal correspondence and diaries. It's not very usual that writer's private correspondence comes out and gets published. Hypothetically, if Kafka's correspondence and diaries were not available to us, would it have made any difference to the way we perceive Kafka as a writer?
Yeah, I feel like that question kind of answered itself, that it has hugely influenced the way we perceive Kafka as a writer. For example, what I started speaking about at the beginning with the Jewish aspects of his writing, maybe they would have come to the fore anyway. There was an early biographer, Ernst Pavel, who really wrote about Kafka as an avatar. Not only, he wrote a really good biography of Kafka, but I think part of his thrust of his biography is reading Kafka through the lens of the question what it means to be born as a Jew in Prague in 1883, speaking German, and Broad, of course, was attuned to it. So it's not that maybe we never would have gotten around in the sort of Anglo-American interpretation of Kafka to really paying close attention to the Jewish themes and the Jewish context of his fiction. And yet it wasn't the initial way Kafka was received. It took some time, and I think what really ended up pushing that one interpretive lens to the fore were the personal writings, were the presence of explicit engagement with Judaism, Zionism, all the different cross currents, the Yiddish theater, Jewish culture in his time and of his own, wrestling with the question of Jewish belonging or also Jewish non-belonging, sense of alienation. That all of that, came so clearly to light in the letters and diaries that then it was almost unavoidable to start to draw connections with themes of his fiction, like abjection, the question of communal belonging, sometimes insuperable obstacles to kind of admission into a sense of belonging. And abjection, shame, guilt, all of those themes suddenly became tinged with this interpretive coloration that probably was greatly enhanced in the consciousness of Anglo-American critics and interpreters and scholars and readers too, by having access to those writings, the personal writings. So in short, I think we would have a different sense of the fiction without that. It's all one. The other thing about Kafka, it becomes clear from the critical edition and from really looking at, the history of his legacy, the really fraught and complicated and almost Byzantine history of the legacy of his papers and his writing, is that, what his writing seemed to be mostly during his lifetime, although he did publish a series of collections of short stories and was attempting to write novels and had aspirations to create a more, let's say, cohesive corpus. But, what he tended to do was kind of pluck things out of this mass of writing that he was constantly generating in his notebooks and his papers and never organized in his lifetime. Only Broad attempted to impose a semblance of organization on it, and we've seen sort of how that developed and ultimately led to what are now thought of as misrepresentations and boulderizations and endless corrections of the record that can never quite ever be set right, because there really is no Kafka without Broad. As I recently saw a wonderful talk by Elif Batuman in Prague, and a program I was part of where she made that point really eloquently of our attempts to sort of separate Kafka from Broad. Well, you can do it in an edition like my translation, where you just translate what Kafka wrote without Broad's emendations. Our overall sense of who Kafka was is inseparable from posthumous history of Broad's introduction of his writings to us and filtering of it, and even explanatory frameworks that we use today we don't credit Broad with, but they go all the way back to Broad's initial commentaries, even as there are others that, for which Broad is often mocked for his overzealousness and presenting Kafka, for example, as a more Zionist figure than he really was. Anyway, that was a tangent, but I think when one looks at that whole history and at Kafka's writing as it really was left at the time of his death, is that there was this kind of endless flux of writing. So things that were published in his lifetime, he continued to rework in his diaries, like in the Penal Colony. After there was a supposedly final, what we would think of today as like a final and definitive version, there are still new versions and alternative endings that he's still, let's say, workshopping, since we use that metaphor, in his diaries. So there was, like, on the one hand, this flow of writing, or this free-flowing writing that was never organized into what we think of as a literary corpus. Things were plucked out and published as standalones, and some of those pieces were parts of larger works, like a work he never finished called Description of the Struggle. He published little sections of it as short stories, or The Stoker is, the first chapter of a novel he never finished, the one that was titled America. He published The Stoker, however, both as a story and then in book form. So these were like little extracts from a large project of writing that contained multitudes and contained letters, diaries, unfinished drafts, rewritings. And it seems to me that the Kafka, if there is something like the Kafka corpus, which there's not, there's this fragmentary corpus, it includes all of it, all of the writing. There was this distinction that is useful as a kind of, is maybe broadly useful, but I don't actually agree with it, by Gerhard Neumann, talking about Kafka's work. He made a distinction between Schrift and Werk. So Schrift being writing and Werk being like a finished, cohesive, final product. And he said, okay, with those pieces Kafka published in his lifetime and cleaned up for publication and created, let's say, a definitive final version of, if we want to use that language, those are Werke, those are works. And the rest of it is Schrift, is writing, everything that was posthumously published. I think the distinction collapses when you see what sort of flux even those works he published in his lifetime continued to be in, as parts of larger unfinished works, or as things he was continuing to rewrite, or at least express his dissatisfaction about how they did come out, and the discrepancy between, say, the version of the transformation, the metamorphosis that he published in his lifetime, and what he saw as the story he really wanted to write, which he thought it was interrupted by a business trip, and therefore the ending was imperfect. So all that is to say, yeah, I think it's all indissoluble, it's all inseparable in the way it's come down to us. We could only kind of artificially impose these kinds of distinctions between Schrift and Werk, or between final versions and rough drafts. What we have is really a continuum of writing that was left with some of the richest writings of modern literature in Kafka's notebooks, papers, published works in his lifetime.